Things Podcast. Hey, Phantomaniacs, welcome to the newest episode of the Needless Things Podcast, where we talk about toys, movies, music, and all manner of pop culture dorkery. I am your host, Dave, and I wasn't going to record the intro until tomorrow morning, or maybe even, or not tomorrow morning. It would either be Thursday morning or Friday morning. I'm on nights right now, which you guys know. I come home from the night shift, I record a loopy, maybe not great intro, and there you go, because that's just how my life is sometimes. But I'm so pumped up right now. I'm so fired up right now. I was like, you know what? Let's knock this intro out. There's a lot going on. Most of it is very specific to me and the people who actually come to the Phantom Zone. But I'll start with something that's a little broader. I mentioned last week, I think, that Troublemaker, the documentary about a year plus in my life by our friend Jason C. Wilson, is complete, and we have very specific plans for it that I cannot announce yet, but I can tell you that many of you will have the opportunity to see Troublemaker in a very, very cool format and venue. That's all I'm going to say for right now. Another cool thing, movie-wise, is I now have a poster, a character poster, because that's the hot thing right now, is the movies now release, like, character posters with some of the primary characters of the movie. Matter of fact, Avengers Endgame just released, like, 30 new character posters for Avenge the Fallen, which, by the way, I could not be any more pumped up for this movie, and every day that goes by that Fandango doesn't send me an email saying, hey, you can buy tickets for this movie now, I get a little crazier. Seriously, can we just go ahead and buy the tickets? We're a month out. We're a month out now. I feel like I've bought tickets like 2 months out for other movies. Please, put these things on sale. Let me secure my seats. It's already bad enough that I have to work the Thursday night that it comes out, and I won't be able to see it until Friday. Please, get on it. What is happening with Avengers Endgame? 3 hours and 2 minutes, I think, is the announced run time. And I don't care. It could be 6, and I'd be delighted. But anyway, so I mentioned a few weeks ago that I went and shot a part for our pal Ryan Cadaver and Kevin Slayfield's forthcoming movie, Joe Striker. And now there is a character poster for the character I played, Bobby Q, which I'll go ahead and break some kayfabe here because, look, you guys are all smart. I'm not fooling any Needless Things listeners with any nonsense. Bobby Q is the character I play in the movie, and I have played a sort of different, an alternate version of Bobby Q before for the mysterious Dale Jepson, where I sang the Pledge of Allegiance, and their video is out there. You can find it. I wish there was more of it, and I wish it was better quality, but one of the great pains of my life is that I don't have somebody like our friend Jason C. Wilson following me around every minute of every day to record all of the awesome stuff that I do. But anyway, my performance as Bobby Q in Joe Striker was recorded, and the character poster is actually pretty cool despite my big fat face with no beard on it, because my hands are in front of my big fat face and they are holding a pistol, and I actually look like I mean business. So I'm pretty happy about this. If you follow me on Instagram as Phantom Troublemaker, or on Facebook as Dave West, or in the Needless Things Podcast Facebook group, you can see this awesome character poster, and you can get updates. You should also follow Joe Striker on Facebook. That's Striker with a Y. Striker with a Y rather than an I. I guess I should clarify that. You don't just throw a Y on. It's not Joe Strikery. That'll be the sequel. But anyway, had so much fun filming that, and now we're that's all starting to come together as well. So I'm stoked for Troublemaker. I'm stoked for Joe Striker. cool stuff going on. However, what I'm excited about today is the brand new computer desk that I'm sitting at. Here's a little inside business for you fans of the Needless Things podcast. For the last few years, I have been sitting at a folding table because I have two monitors here, and I had bought a computer desk. When I buy computer desks, I buy them on clearance. I don't pay $300 whatever dollars for a brand new top of the line computer desk. I wait until Office Depot or Fry's, or I think I got one at Sam's one time. The best computer desk I've ever owned I got from Sam's for like $100, and it was this gigantic U-shaped thing with like cabinets, and it was amazing. And actually our good friend Arian, our friends Arian and Big Jason Frazier helped me move that thing once, and I think there's still a piece of it somewhere around here, probably in the storage room. But yeah, I buy my computer desks on clearance because computer desks go on clearance all the time. And this one, I got it from Office Depot online. It was a very good price for what it is, and it's just an L-shaped desk. But I looked at it online, and I was like, man, it was one of those deals where I could totally picture it in my head here in the Phantom Zone with everything on it, where everything would go. There were no space issues. It was really I looked at it and I was like, holy shit, that is perfect. And so now it arrived the other day. Phantom Jr. helped me put it together, which, by the way, he's helped me with plenty of projects over the years, but this is the one where he was like legit helpful and not just kid helping dad. Like it was actually this and Jabba's sail barge, two recent projects where he was just straight up helpful and not like, hey, can you hand me the screwdriver? Like both of those I literally couldn't have done without his help, which is like a really good feeling. And I mean, he's 11 years old. He's getting to that age where the cognitive functions are happening and the it's all coming together for him at this point. So it was great. We had a blast sitting down here listening to music, putting this desk together. He chose They Might Be Giants. We listened to some De La Soul. We listened to some Devo. We listened to some Ramones. All on vinyl, of course, because I'm a big, stupid vinyl person when I'm here in the Phantom Zone. So yeah, this thing has changed the Phantom Zone in its entirety, because now I have more space in this area, and there are going to be new shelves to put the sail barge, the big Millennium Falcon, a bunch of the larger Star Wars pieces that I have are going to go to the right of this thing, and then to the left of it, the shelves that those pieces are on right now are going to come to the left of this desk and be storage for... I've got a lot of unopened toys, a lot of collectible things that are just sort of I need to get to these and figure out what to do with them. So I'm going to have two whole new areas of big shelving. One that's display, one that's practical storage, that the stupid old computer desk and the folding table were taking up all that space before. You guys know how good it feels when like a living space comes together and you're like, oh my gosh, this can go. It's like playing Tetris. That piece goes there, that piece goes there, done. Blam, eliminated those problems. They're taken care of. And that right now I'm in the process of clearing off all of the junk that was on my desk or on the folding table is still on there, and I'm boxing it up or figuring out where it goes. The sail barge was sitting on a folding table. It's currently sitting on that crappy old computer desk because it's actually the perfect size for that. And if I didn't need the space below it, that's just where your legs go, I'd probably just leave it on that. But instead I have shelves coming where I'll be able to utilize that space vertically as well as horizontally. So it looks cool on this little desk, but it's going to look so much cooler when these shelves come in. So that's part of why I'm excited. Another part of why I'm excited is I have so many podcasts in the can right now, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you about them because they're done and they're going up. Today's episode is all about the history of wrestling toys with our pals R.T. Ewell, Rich from Nerdy Laser, and Chris DePetrillo from Figures Toy Company, and also many other things. Chris is great. Rich is great. They both do tons of stuff. So today's episode about wrestling toys. And when I say the history of wrestling toys, you know how we do. It's not in 1974, the very first wrestling toy was released by Rubber Ray's Toy Company. We don't do that. We talk about our personal histories with wrestling toys, our recollections, the things that we're connected to. And it's a really fun episode. We had a blast recording it, and we could probably do a whole other episode about specific lines and stuff. But we cover, if you're 30 to 40 years old, we cover our life of wrestling toys. It's a cool episode, and you're going to enjoy it. Next week on the show, we are going to have a wrestling-centric, because we're on the road to WrestleMania. That's what this is all about. That's why last week's Needless Commentary was the Stone Cold Steve Austin film Hunt to Kill. And now the road to WrestleMania continues with wrestling toys. And next week, our pals Mike and Arian, or at least this is the plan. This one's not in the can yet because we can't record until the last Raw and SmackDown before WrestleMania. But our pals Mike and Arian, Mike Gordon that is, are going to sit down and we're going to discuss what the heck is going on with WWE. The week after that, we have a extra special Game of Thrones, the story so far episode that is in the can. I'm excited. It's great. The week after that is going to be April's Needless Commentary, which has yet to be determined. And then the week after that is already in the can. I recorded an episode about Jabba's sail barge, the Katana, the new toy, with Victoria's Cantina, which you should go ahead and Google Victoria's Cantina right now. Check out their YouTube videos. Check out their podcast. There's all kinds of stuff going on over there. They cover Jurassic Park toys, which I didn't know, which is very exciting because, as you may know, I voted that best toy line of 2018. Even though I am not personally collecting it, I'm collecting it vicariously through Phantom Jr., and it's seriously incredible. So check out Victoria's Cantina and know that on April 26th, our Victoria's Cantina is going to be on the Needless Things podcast talking about, Star Wars toys in general a little bit, but specifically about Jabba's sail barge. And I had a lot of fun talking to Victoria and recording that episode, and hopefully she'll be back on. Matter of fact, I'd like to have her and Adam Paulus on at some point just for a crazy Star Wars toy discussion. So there you go. Lots of cool stuff going on. I'm excited. I'm motivated. Things are happening. I feel like I'm getting back into the groove. I need to listen to some Madonna, some 80s era Madonna to really get myself pumped up and ready for everything that lies ahead. The rest of 2019 is looking pretty cool. Like, I have some specific stuff to look forward to, and I'm stoked about it. But right now, what we have to look forward to is wrestling toys with Rich and Chris DePetrillo. Enjoy. I say we just get into it. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, let's roll.
Okay, so for me, when I think back to the earliest wrestling toys I can think of, and now when I was a kid, I didn't have any wrestling figures because my parents were not fans of me watching wrestling or really knowing anything about wrestling. And actually, real quick, I do want to mention the passing of the first heel that I ever knew of, that I was ever terrified of, and that is King Kong Bundy. Passed away yesterday afternoon, and when I was a kid, because of course I snuck off and watched wrestling late nights on Saturdays, but the angle where he broke Hogan's ribs, I think was the deal that ended up being settled in the steel cage at WrestleMania 3. Is that correct?
WrestleMania 2.
WrestleMania 2, okay.
Yep.
So I saw the angle where he hit the avalanche on Hogan in the corner.
Yes.
And in my kid mind, he broke Hogan's back. And I was devastated. And this guy was just a horrible, scary, scary monster. The first, before Freddy, before Jason, before Pinhead, King Kong Bundy was like the first person I saw that I was really scared of.
Before all the guys that are on your toy shelf.
Yes, exactly. Which, by the way, I do have a King Kong Bundy up on the. He's still on the Legends of Professional Wrestling blister card.
Nice, the very first FTC legend.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Bought at Hot Topic in probably 1997, I think. 97 or 98, maybe.
98, because the Bundy came out about a year before I joined up with them, and that was in 99.
Yeah, and I've still got that King Kong Bundy figure. I had to buy it, man, because not only was he this incredible heel, he was also on Married with Children.
Oh, yeah.
What do you guys have any specific memories of Bundy?
He terrified me when I was a kid. He was just ugly, right? Like, he was a big, bald, fat guy and, like, always counted to 5. He wanted the ref to count to 5.
Yes, that's right.
And I always loved that gimmick. And I have his LJN action figure, which is heavy enough to kill a small child.
I always like to say they could knock out a donkey.
Man, I mean, that thing's a lot of rubber.
They all are. They're the most dense rubber ever produced by man. What about you, Chris? Do you have any fond memories of King Kong Bundy?
Yeah, and besides the mid '80s memories that all three of us have for him, I remember being 13, 14, 15 years old when he made his comeback, and I remembered him from my youth, and I thought that he was going to be this real big deal, and I remember him flopping completely and having an awful match with Undertaker and just kind of becoming another face in the crowd with Ted DiBiase's corporation, and I just kind of remember thinking, this is the guy that main evented a WrestleMania, and now he's just kind of this mid-card bum here on WWF Superstars and Monday Night Raw. And I just remember this was around the time I started getting into the backstage news and the smart quote unquote side of things and everything, so I didn't really understand everything to that extent yet, and just thinking, why is this guy not anything? Why are they just making him into a bum? I thought this was the guy that was like going to destroy the Undertaker and destroy Bret Hart, and he's just kind of floundering against Adam Bomb. Right, so that actually probably stands out more to me than the memories that we've talked about with of WrestleMania 2 and the 5 count and stuff like that. It's that he went from being such a pivotal point in the wrestling boom to kind of just being an afterthought less than 10 years later.
Well, and that speaks, I think, to guys who sort of try to hold on longer than they should, because, Vader, one of the greatest big men of all time, one of the scariest heels of all time, but part of his legacy in my head will always be that terrible night on Raw. I can't remember exactly what he did, but I remember him rolling out of the ring and saying, "I'm just a fat piece of shit."
Oh, that was a pay-per-view. I want to say that was the first. I want to say it was the first Judgment Day pay-per-view or the first Unforgiven in '98.
Oh, Unforgiven sounds right.
Yeah, it was either one of those in '98 when he did the whole dejected thing, and at that point I was deeply invested in learning the inside scoops and whatnot. So that one was just surprising to me, because you've got Vader, of all people, playing this woe is me, pitiful character, and it just did not mesh well.
No, not at all. Not at all. He never should have been anything less than just that era's Brock Lesnar, basically.
Absolutely. With his White Castle of Fear.
So, but all respect to King Kong Bundy, who was just a massive force in the business when we were kids, and a truly scary guy who embodied his gimmick perhaps better than a lot of guys of the era. So, talking about, we've already brought up wrestling toys. Because it's inescapable. The three of us are not going to be able to have a conversation without mentioning wrestling toys in some capacity. And that is the point of today's episode, is to just sort of reminisce about the whole wrestling toy phenomenon, because obviously wrestling is a hugely marketable piece of entertainment. There's all kinds of tie-ins. They're basically superheroes fighting in the ring. And, of course, kids and adults want action figures of that. And I wanted the three of us to get together and just kind of crush our brains together and figure out some of the coolest stuff that we remember from our lives. And going back, the first ones that I was aware of were the big rubber LJN figures. What about you guys?
Absolutely. For me as well, that was the first ones that I remember getting, the first ones that I remember seeing, and the first ones, that might be the first non-Masters of the Universe toy line that I really, truly started getting deeply invested in.
And what's funny about those is, I say I'm a toy snob, and I don't mean that as any kind of compliment to myself whatsoever. Sometimes my pickiness gets the best of me. But those figures, in theory, I should not like, because they're completely unarticulated. The likenesses are very, very 80s, but man, I never had any when I was a kid, because like I said, my parents were not at all supportive of my wrestling fandom. But as an adult, I now have a small collection of those, and I love them because they're these big, thick, heavy, like, they sort of embody what wrestlers are. They're these solid, almost dangerous toys.
Yeah, I agree with that. I never had them as a kid either, Dave, which is, it's crazy to me that I watched wrestling a lot, and I loved wrestling, still do, obviously, and I never had them as a kid. I don't remember them in stores. I just don't remember them. They're just not a part. I don't even remember commercials about them. I don't remember wrestling figures until Hasbro's come out. And then I saw the prime time they'd have them on there, and they would talk about the toys.
Yeah, I that's the thing, is I don't I remember seeing the LJN figures in Lionel Playworld, but the Hasbro WWF figures, which we'll get to in a little bit, I don't really remember seeing those at retail. But I want to stick with the LJNs for a minute. Now, Chris, when you were a kid, what were your guys like? What did you have collection wise of those LJN figures?
I remember the very first two that I got were Hulk Hogan and Big John Studd. So, if you're getting any type of toy line, I think it's always important to have a hero and a villain, two guys that can face off with each other. Yeah. And the LJNs at that point were not compatible with anything like Masters of the Universe or G.I. Joe or anything, so it's not like you could pull a Toy Story and kind of meld the worlds together. So I remember having Hogan and Big John Studd. I remember getting Cowboy Bob Orton. I had Ricky the Dragon Steamboat because he, to this day, is still one of my all-time favorites. I had a pretty extensive collection of the line. I remember my grandmother ordering some for me outside of the inside cover of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. There used to be like a full-page ad of them, and you would see the Demolition Axe figure and Bam Bam Bigelow, and some of the rarer figures in the line were in that picture as well. I also remember that one of my favorites of all time is known for having notoriously one of the worst wrestling figures of all time. I'm speaking, of course, of Ravishing Rick Rude, who had a figure doing the Rick Rude pose, and that's pretty much all it could do in LJN style.
I'm glad
Unless you're trying to do a double DDT, that's pretty much all he was good for.
I'm glad you mentioned the ad, because it made me remember that most of my exposure to the LJN figures came via Marvel Comics. Because back in the 80s, every issue of like Uncanny X-Men or Spider-Man would have those like newsprint ads with the illustrations of the LJN figures.
Mm-hmm.
Those were everywhere, and that was how I was aware these figures were out there. Did Orton have the cast on his arm?
I don't believe so.
Oh, what a terrible omission, although I guess it's easy enough to make a custom cast if you're so inclined.
Yeah, you need some, not Scotch tape, but get some white tape and you're good. And then you can have a cast anytime you want. You can make him to the Mummy. You gimmick.
You can make him into the Yeti.
the Yeti.
Put him in the freezer as a block of ice.
Yeah, I got lucky a few years ago, and a friend of mine who was moving just handed me a big bag of the LJN figures, and they're all in, because if you're a modern day collector wanting to collect those, they're a little difficult to find in good shape because the paint comes off pretty easily in storage. And I managed to get a few that I'm very happy to have, and my favorite is the Jesse Ventura.
Great figure.
Oh my gosh, with the pink tights. I'm looking at him right now. The pink tights, the blue boots, the blue headband, the sunglasses, just looking like, it's cast in rubber. It's an 80s likeness, but it's Jesse the Body Ventura. It just looks fantastic. I am now a big fan of these figures just for what they represent and what they are.
And to think that they just relaunched LJN. We're talking about figures that are over 30 years old, and it's a testament to how fondly so many people look back on them as their first wrestling figures or their first collections or anything, that they've brought them back in a modern style.
Oh, now wait, I'm not aware of this.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah, the Young Bucks have LJN figures. LJN's trademark is now either owned or licensed by Chalkline, who makes the 80s style, like the souvenir varsity jackets.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they are making LJN-style figures. They released a Young Bucks 2-pack.
Oh, that's fantastic. Wow. Well, and also...
And they look nice, too.
Thinking back a little further, they did the LJN variants, like the Chase figures, in the Jakks Classic line.
I was just getting ready to mention that, because I've got Trish Stratus... And Trish is over there on the wall. I can't remember who the other one I have is. I've got one other one. So it might be Stone Cold.
Yep, Stone Cold was one of them. They had like a little bit of almost like a manga look to them as well.
Yeah, they're very interesting. Yeah, you're right. Like an animated style, sort of. But really neat that they brought that back. Jakks Pacific did some really fantastic things.
Oh, I love Jakks. And we'll get into that too, I'm sure.
Yeah, we absolutely will. So... the LJN stuff, any wrestling fan is going to have a soft spot, or any wrestling fan our age anyway is going to have a soft spot for the LJN figures. But the ones that actually got me started collecting wrestling toys in the late 90s, after they were no longer being produced, were Hasbro's WWF figures. I get WWF Superstars. I'm not even sure if that line had a proper name.
No, it was just WWF.
Yeah, just WWF toys.
It was pretty much differentiated by the color coding on the cards.
And what's funny to me about this line is because here's how I got into it is having been a toy collector for decades now, in the late 90s, you could go to basically any Goodwill or thrift store and buy big plastic bags full of toys for like $2. This is sort of right before toy collecting and speculating on retro toys and stuff like that became a thing. So you could get whole bags of the Hasbro WWF figures for nothing. And I bought 2 bags from one Goodwill, a couple bags from another one, and of course you get duplicate figures. You get figures with the paint scratched all off, whatever. But in my head, these coincided with rock and wrestling. because the look of the figures very much reflects the animation style of Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling cartoon, but they actually came much later than that cartoon.
Yeah. But you're right. They really do. The Roddy especially. The Roddy and the Hogan, I can really see that.
Yeah, and for years I thought that they were the direct spawn of that cartoon, but Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling was, 84 or something, 84, 85, and these were coming out in the 90s.
Yep. It's probably just fans, that worked for Hasbro that liked the cartoon, or it was just hey, kids like that cartoon, let's use that as a platform.
But how wild is it? And I would be interested in both of your input on this. That for years the WWF figure line, looking at the modern figure line, these realistic figures that have this new scanning technology, and now we're getting likenesses that really look like the wrestlers. But for years, these cartoony little plastic figures with very gimmicky action features were the core of WWF's presence in the action figure aisle. That's so funny to me that was the case. Rich, what was your engagement level with this line, or what is it?
Well, it was sort of a little later. I mean, I think just like a year or two had went by, and I worked at a flea market, and he sold toys and comics and all that. So I got a lot from him, and I saw a lot come through there, just like the LJNs. But the Hasbro line, it's just incredible, and I think part of it is that they look like cartoons, and 90% of them were great likenesses. I mean, there's just some absolutely perfect figures in that line that will never be beat. I love the Sergeant Slaughter. It's one of my favorite figures. I just love the look of it, and I think it's perfect. But it's just hard not to just love this line. I mean, so much that it came back.
Yeah. Mattel has been doing retro-style versions. Well, they've been doing classic wrestlers that were released as part of this line, but they've also been doing Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn and New Day, which it's driving me crazy that I haven't found New Day yet.
I missed that whole line in the store, Macho and New Day.
I think everybody did. From what I understand, they all went straight to like Five Below and TJ Maxx and Ross.
It's so dumb.
No, they actually have had that set in my local Target, but only one Target. In fact, I think there's still a Kofi Kingston on the shelf.
Oh, my gosh, that's wild.
But with those, I found the New Day on Amazon, but Macho Man never got listed on Amazon through Amazon. It was always through a third party, with scalper-level prices.
Right.
And so I did not complete the set until I found Macho Man at Target right around Christmas time. And I know some Five Belows, Richard and I had talked about this before, were actually getting that wave in.
Yep.
My Five Below got in the wave with Ric Flair, Finn Balor, Sami Zayn, and Kevin Owens, which that was the wave after the Macho Man New Day wave. And now that same wave is sitting for full price of $12.99 in Target, a mere mile away from the Five Below that I found them at multiple times.
Mattel's distribution has always been very, very questionable, because now, with those two waves, some having gone to regular retail, some having gone to discount stores, but now I've found the latest wave, which is Chris Jericho, Sheamus, Shawn Michaels. Oh gosh,
yep.
I can't.
Kurt Angle.
Kurt Angle.
Yeah, Kurt Angle. Yeah.
I've seen in literally every Walmart I go to.
Yep, every Walmart around here, the two that I go to they have tons of them.
And those ones are out in Walmart, and the latest set with Braun Strowman is available on Amazon right now.
Yeah, they're like $13.99, I think, which is
they're full price.
Yeah, it's a little bit, because I think in the store they're $11.99, and I realize $2 if you actually want the figure is not a huge deal, but I still have a little bit of old school toy hunter in me.
Yeah, I know.
Sure.
So I balk at that, but yeah, I've loved that Mattel is doing this style again, and as far as those figures go, they're generally very easy to get. You can still find them in thrift stores. You can go to toy shows, and they're always there. They're sort of omnipresent, and I guess Hasbro just produced tons and tons of these things back in the day. The only issue is, like with the LJN figures, they're wrestling figures, so kids banged them together and beat them up, and the paint apps are missing. You get a Rick Rude without his mustache, or whatever the case may be. But they're fun, they're simple, and there's just something very appealing about like having Alpha and Sika as just these sort of static, ridiculously over-muscled, cartoony figures. Like, I just like this style a lot. Again, it's that sort of, it's a little silly, but they're awesome at the same time.
Well, and I think it's easier to have figures that aren't accurate. You know what I mean? Like, we can be so critical if it doesn't look exactly like them, if they're claiming it's a real face scan or whatever.
Yeah. So
with these little figures, if we just think, oh, they're cartoons, it doesn't matter what they look like, unless you base it off the Ric Flair, which is terrible. The craziest eyebrows you'll ever see on the original Ric Flair is a nightmare. Like, I don't know who that is.
But as long as you can look at it and go, oh, that's Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
It's true, and and some of them are just perfect. I mean, they really are. That Hacksaw is great, and the accessories, they came with accessories. I mean, you got both Demolition. Actually, you got all three. You even got Crush, and you got the Demolition mask as well, which is something LJN never did, as far as they never released Smash, right?
Yeah, they only did Demolition X. He was a one-off because the line got canceled before they could continue. And Hasbro came not that long after LJN ended because they were still selling the back stock of figures in PWI in 1989 magazines when Hasbro picked up the license and started releasing figures in 1989, because it was for Christmas of 89 when my grandmother ordered the gift set from the JCPenney catalog of the Hasbro ring, which came with Macho Man and Hulk Hogan from Series 1.
Oh, man, I miss the JCPenney and
Me
Sears
too.
exclusives.
Yes.
That you'd go in the wish book, and not only would there be like all the toys you ever wanted, but then they'd have crazy special stuff that might be just special gift sets, but might be recolored. Like, I remember they did from G.I. Joe, the Hiss Tank and the Asp in like Crimson Guard red. And that was a Sears exclusive, and it's the only way you could get it. Like, there was all kinds of cool stuff like that. And actually, now that I've said that, I feel like there were some Sears Wishbook exclusive Hasbro WWF figures. Like, that maybe had slightly different paint jobs or something. I should have done more research, you guys.
Well, I know there's some mail-ins, but yeah.
Yeah, we had a bunch of those at Figures Toy Company because, I love the Hasbro figures. It's one of my favorite toy lines overall to collect. I could actually tell you in order the figures from Series 1 that my grandmother got from me just because of how hyped I was for it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
With Hasbro being a local company, not only were they in the national chains, but they were in local stores too, local pharmacies and whatnot, and going a little further to when I realized what Figures Toy Company was and started working there. And I've probably mentioned this on this podcast before. I know I talked about it on our Friend Fully Posable podcast, but it was a Hasbro figure that led to me getting hired at Figures Toy Company because in 1999, my friend was going to flea markets and going to thrift stores and things that we've just talked about over the last few minutes. And the last set of Hasbro, the green card set, was considered the rarest. And he found out that Figures Toy Company, a.k.a. Figures Inc., was selling several of them through their mail-order catalog, and he ordered the Yokozuna, and I took him to go pick it up since we found out that FTC was local and had a warehouse nearby. And when I took him to get that figure, that brought me to meet the owner of FTC, which brought on a conversation, which led to me getting hired. So I actually have WWF Hasbro to thank for my career in the toy industry.
Wow, that is awesome. Oh, man, it's crazy how that kind of thing can happen. That, like, for anybody out there that's listening, you never know when a connection is going to be made, when you're going to meet someone or be in a situation that's going to change your life forever, which is a good reason to always be putting your best foot forward and being your best you. But if we can move off of the inspirational speeches for a moment. So those are two of the earliest lines that I think pretty much any wrestling fan is certainly aware of. Shortly after discovering those lovely grab bags full of Hasbro WWF figures, got big into around 90, well, it was 96, because Bash at the Beach, the Hogan turn, is when I got fully invested in wrestling again. I was living in an apartment with 3 other people we would tape Raw, we would watch Nitro live, and as soon as Nitro was over, we would watch Raw. Now, sometime around then, I became aware of Jack Pacific's Bone Crunching. Was it Bone Crunching or Bone Crushing?
Bone Crunching.
Crunching. I became aware of Jack Pacific's Bone Crunching action figures. I bought a Stone Cold Steve Austin just because he was the coolest person on the planet at the time. But it was this rubber figure with the kind of goofy likeness, and it just didn't really do anything for me. And at that point, I was aware of Jack Pacific's figures, but I really wasn't interested in collecting them. Were you guys at this point in time, and I couldn't give you specific dates about when Jack Pacific got the WWF license or when they started. I think Bone Crunch in Action, that was their first type of wrestling figure, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the Series 1, yeah. I love Jax, and I love this line. It wasn't great, but it was all we had, and they weren't shy about releasing them as time went on. But the first series is actually, I think, really good. I mean, the Ultimate Warrior out of that series I really like, and to those that don't know, it was bone crunching because the joints in the elbow and the knees, they kind of popped. They had these they had these holes in them, and so you could so it wasn't really like a bone crunch. It was more like a toothpick snapping.
Well, older, wiser me appreciates this technology now because it's actually like a rubber skin over this armature.
Yeah.
That has in the the elbows and the knees, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's I guess there has to be a joint there, like a ratchet joint, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was in some way, yeah, the elbows and the knees did not bend at all, except for just
they bent, but
just
they didn't
a bit.
Stay there.
Yeah, they bent so you could make that sound.
Right. But they did have, they had joints at the hips, like V joints or whatever, and then the shoulders swiveled, and then they had a neck joint. So they did have 5 points of articulation, and you looking at them, they were technically better than the LJN figures because you could get more wrestling poses out of them they had hard plastic bodies and then rubber arms and legs, so you could force them into poses and stuff.
Yeah, one of my favorite things that I own, and I still own it, it's the longest thing I've probably ever kept in my collection because I usually sell or trade or lose or whatever. But I think it was Diamond had an exclusive 2-pack of Diesel and Razor Ramon.
Yes.
Who, when these came out, were already in WCW as the NWO. So the funniest part about this is they only stuck Diesel and Razor together because of Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Diesel and Razor Ramon didn't really cross paths that much in WWF. So they sold this 2-pack, and I still have it. It's the only, like I said, it's the only thing I've ever kept as long, and they're good figures. That first series really is good, I think. Jax did a lot of questionable stuff too, but I think they have some good ones out there. The Godwins are two of my favorites. figures, not so much the wrestlers, but I found a set of the Godwins, and they're great. They're just so. I have them propped up on my shelf, and they're just so pleasant to look at. They're just because they're kind of that cartoony way of doing things. You know, they weren't technically accurate, and they had goofy expressions, but they were close enough.
Well, and they've actually got tons of paint apps. Like their overalls are like acid washed looking overalls. They've got and by the way, those Godwins would not be released in any way today.
And you know what's funny is the Godwins that I got are I think they were the second released ones where they are wearing Rebel flags.
Yeah. Well, that's
as shirts.
One of them. I think one of them has the actual Rebel flag shirt under his overalls, and the other one's like slightly different, but they both have the Confederate flag on them. Yeah, not going to be hitting toy shelves anytime soon.
No, and you thought Al Snow was discontinued for a reason.
Yeah, and I have that figure on the card, Al Snow with head.
That's great.
Chris, what about you? What are your memories of that early Jakks Pacific stuff?
I was all in on Jakks. I'll steer the conversation just slightly off track for a second, in that as much as I love wrestling, the saddest thing to me was that I had all these different characters, but the characters across the lines didn't match up. So I still had my LJNs, but then I had my Hasbros, but now we've got Jakks. So I couldn't have Ricky the Dragon Steamboat from LJN take on Stone Cold Steve Austin like they were feuding in WCW because they didn't match up well at all. You know, so that was like the one disappointing thing about how all these licenses kept shifting. But over time, Jakks would give us so much.
Everything.
And the Bone Crunch figures, absolutely. And I mean, even if you think about the bone crunching figures, let alone, you know, as we get deeper into Jakks, a Don Callis Jackal figure, a Dan Severn figure. You know, these are figures that never got touched upon at all to this day. I mean, yeah, they did Dan Severn in UFC, but wrestling-wise, that's the only way you could get him. And it's just amazing to look back at these figures, which were, you know, just mind-blowing in 96 and seeing how far we've come. But back in 96, you know, who would have thought we'd get a modernized Ultimate Warrior, or that Diesel and Razor Ramon would be out at the same time their careers are starting to peak, or, you know, a Goldust action figure, you know, because for about a year in between Hasbro and Jakks, all we had were like the little Just Toys Bendums. So it was just great to have these 6-inch actually playable, actually posable action figures of the guys that were on TV during an era where wrestling was really starting to get back to the top of the mountain.
And if I remember correctly, Goldust even came with a wig, or at least one of the Goldusts came with a wig.
The first one did, yep.
Okay. So, and I will say this, Jakks Pacific was, I might even say, and I would have to sit down and do some research and think about it, but I would say is possibly one of the most innovative toy companies in the history of toy companies, because they were always trying new things. They were always upping their game. They were always putting out, you know, the Bone Crunch and action figures were very, very successful. But then they came along with I cannot remember the name of it, but they were the Titantron interactive figures.
Yeah, Titantron.
Yeah, they were just Titantron.
Okay.
The Titantron Live series.
And these were the ones that actually had the beginnings of what I think of today as Jakks Pacific articulation, where they had actual knee joints. They had the shoulder joints with the, I don't know the technical term, and you think I would being such a toy guy, but the ball-jointed shoulders with the swivel biceps. They had the elbows. They had the turning wrists. I mean, that was a huge step to go from the rubber bone crunching action figures to these Titantron figures, and that's where I started collecting Jakks Pacific regularly. And I bought that Titantron stage, and I bought that Stone Cold Steve Austin wearing the jeans. Why they released the one in the long jeans first, I'll never understand. But man, what innovators those guys were.
Yeah, I wasn't so much into that line for some reason. It was just that period of time where I wasn't really collecting them as much. But I agree with you. And also want to point out that something else that couldn't have happened is Marlena. It comes with a cigar. So that's something else that probably would not happen nowadays.
Well, I was working at... there were two key factors in my becoming so engrossed in that Titantron line. One, I was working at KB Toys at the time. Two, Toy Fair magazine had happened. And
I love both of those things, by the way. KB Toys and Toy Fair are just the best.
Oh, absolutely. And Toy Fair covered that Titantron, that first wave of Titantron figures was in an issue of Toy Fair magazine, and I believe it was even on the cover. And it was a huge deal, and at this point, I was fully immersed into professional wrestling, perhaps as much as I've ever been, because it was 97 or 98 maybe. Chris, do you have a year for those guys?
The Titantron figure started in 99.
Oh, 99. Okay, so 99... Yep. And that was big time. I mean, I was way in at that point. And I just wanted anything. So those Titantron figures, which were articulated, not the best articulation, but you know, better than the rubber guys. And, I mean, that at that point, that was when I got all in on the Jakks figures, to the point where I was buying the older Bone Crunching stuff from KB where I was working, because there was a 3-pack that I bought. Gosh, now that I'm thinking back, okay, so Jakks did a line of higher end. They did Mankind and Undertaker. I've actually
the statue, the Ripped and Ruthless,
the giant. Yep.
Yeah, Ripped and Ruthless.
Were they Ruthless Aggression? Is that what those were?
No. Were the statue ones that didn't move?
Well, they had like the 5 points of articulation.
Yeah,
but they were very much.
They had like a background,
and they were
in like odd-shaped boxes.
Yeah, and they were screwed into a base.
Yes, yep, that's the Ripped and Ruthless.
Ripped and Ruthless, yes, that's right. And they did Undertaker and Mankind, and obviously I'm sure they did Stone Cold. But I bought Undertaker and Mankind because those figures, to this day, those are some of my favorite Undertaker and Mankind figures. And then they had a 3-pack. I think it was the Bone Crunching action of the Three Faces of Foley.
Yep.
Yes, yep.
That had the Mankind that was, I think, one of the only Bone Crunching action figures to feature a joint, because his elbow had a joint in it. A pivot, just a pivot. So he could do the mandible claw.
Oh,
He was one of the only ones, but it was Mankind, Dude Love, and Cactus Jack, and I was all in. And at that point, I was like, man, Jakks Pacific is the shit. I love them. And what else? Stomp. Do you guys remember Stomp?
Stomp. Yep. Series 1, which was the Commando series.
Yeah,
and
they had the Snap-on armor, the crazy Sable figure with like the outer space armor.
Well, those were different series. So the first one was more like a military commando set, and then the second series was an underwater set, and then the third series was outer space.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's the militant farmer, Ahmed Johnson.
The militant farmer and the Ahmed Johnson. Yeah, I love the space, the WWE space combination. I'm all in. They need to make this now.
They need to make an animated movie of that.
Yeah, I would love the space stuff. Like that line is really cool. Stomp, the second series, Owen Hart, died around this time, and he doesn't have that many figures. He has a few, but one of them is in Stomp Series 2, and of course they did release a Blue Blazer, which I do own still.
I do as well, and actually I'm looking at it on my wall right now, that beautiful Blue Blazer with the fabric cape with the furry trim on it. Yeah, it's up on my wall right now.
So I got a great story about that. So it's when I worked at the flea market, and this lady that sold mainly NASCAR stuff, she had a Blue Blazer there for a long time. I mean, it just sat there and sat there. And so, unfortunately, when Owen Hart passed, that next Saturday, I was like, I wonder if she still has that. Because it was a kind of a tough figure to find.
Yeah, even before he passed,
yes.
like it wasn't a huge release. Like it wasn't easy to find.
Yeah. So the next Saturday, I get there when she opens her booth, and I asked to buy it. And she sold it to me, and after I paid for it, I was like, oh, I'm glad I got this. He's the one that died last week. And then she was like, oh, if I had known, because she was one of those kind of, she would have raised the price $40.
Well, and that's what happened, though, is because in that time period, there were toy stores oriented towards collectors everywhere. You know, now it's weird to think of because really all we have now is Target, Walmart, and like Amazon and Big Bag Toy Store or whatever. But, you know, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were independently owned toy stores all over the place that were marketing to collectors, that were carrying everything from the current Star Wars to comic book figures to stuff they ordered from previews to whatever, to wrestling figures. These are the people that would go to Toys R Us and buy up all the stock before you could get to it. But these little independent toy stores were all over the place, and one week that Blue Blazer figure would be on the peg with every other Jakks Pacific figure for, you know, $5 to $10, whatever it was. And then the next week after, was it No Mercy?
Over the Edge.
Over the Edge, unfortunately.
The week after Over the Edge, all of a sudden that Blue Blazer, you know, in certain stores was like $60.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that, I mean, Jakks is really impressive. And real quick before we move on to our next recollection, because honestly, we could do a whole episode just about Jakks Pacific and their contribution. Not only
it went on so long.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it went from those bone crunching action all the way up to their WWE classic figures, that the deluxe figures that I've got several of those on the wall as well. I've got one signed by Kevin Nash, one signed by Sergeant Slaughter. My absolute favorite wrestling figure that I own, a William Regal Ruthless Aggression figure that came with the die-cast gold belt.
Yes. Yep, the 100.
Yeah. My favorite wrestling figure, my favorite wrestling figure of my favorite wrestler ever. But I'm curious to know from you guys, out of the Jakks Pacific stuff, do you have a favorite line or a favorite figure from what they did, or both?
Oh yeah, I mean, I love Jakks overall. From seeing those figures, like I said, you know, at the time I'm in high school or getting older, where I'm, you know, independently wealthy and working and have something new to blow my money on, but all the way up through, you know, my career at Figures Toy Company and getting to actually, you know, I actually get to do exclusives with Jakks for FTC. So there's a lot of limited edition packs out there that I created because they were limited run, sold through FTC. There's a Jeff Hardy, Bret Hart Classic Superstars 2-pack, which was a dream match 2-pack that I got to do because it was when Jeff Hardy was the Intercontinental Champion. So we packaged the old style belt with Bret and the new style belt with Jeff.
Yeah.
They were both famous for ladder matches at various points. So, you know, that was really cool to be able to do that. But I think that the Ruthless Aggression and the Classic Superstars to this day is such an extensive roster of people that we will maybe never, ever get to see done through Mattel or in the Mattel style. You know, everybody prides themselves on thinking that Mattel is the greatest, and they're certainly doing some great work, but I don't see Mattel being in a rush to make a Zeus figure or a Tank Abbott.
Right.
Any of those people. You know, Jakks was so offbeat with their selection sometimes, but it really worked if you're a diehard collector and want as many faces as possible. And one of my favorite sets of all time is my favorite two wrestlers of all time, my favorite tag team of all time, and it was a set that was only sold in Toys R Us, and it was a Classic Superstars 2-pack of Brian Pillman and Stone Cold Steve Austin, but as Steve Austin with the hair as the Hollywood Blondes. And that is the only time we've gotten anything resembling a stunning Steve Austin figure to this day.
Yeah, Jakks dug really deep with that Classics line, and it's funny because every time you thought, man, they really couldn't pull anybody more, I don't want to say obscure, but anybody more surprising out, they would sign some new talent and put out, like you said, Dan Severn. At the point they released a Dan Severn figure, there was not exactly a huge percentage of the population clamoring for a Dan the Beast Severn figure.
We got a Steve Blackman figure, too.
Well, hang on.
Several.
Steve Blackman is one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time. You just watch yourself, buddy boy.
I apologize.
But yeah, Jakks really... Yeah. Mattel's doing a good job. But Jakks
It's a different time. It's a different time now.
Well, it's a different time, but Jakks Pacific, they got it, man. They were very clearly fans. They knew not just the business, but the history of the business. And they did just some amazing stuff. Like I don't think because we got a Bruiser Brody from them, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
We're not going to get a Bruiser Brody from Mattel. We're just not. It's not going to happen.
We can't even get a gobbledygooker that they actually showed one time.
Right. And we're certainly not going to get a Yeti, although I don't think anybody's done a Yeti, so maybe that's too tall an order.
One of my favorite things from Jakks, before we get off the subject, was the box sets. You know, they do box sets now, but they're usually just like a straight shot. Like they're all the figures are just in a line or whatever. But some of those box sets, like you mentioned, the Faces of Foley. Yeah. I remember a Buried Alive box set that is just gorgeous. The packaging is beautiful. The way they package stuff was great. And I just really, their box sets were some of my favorites. And unfortunately, I don't have any anymore, but I've wanted to get that Buried Alive set. I don't know how expensive it is now, but at one time it was a couple $100, but I don't know if it's gone down or raising up. Because a lot of those figures, like, I love them, but you know, there's a certain collector that doesn't like them, that don't like the Jakks figures, especially that early stuff, because they're not, you know, accurate or whatever. So, you know, it's a weird market out there.
Well, I had, and look, there are all kinds of toy mistakes I've made in my life that I'm still kicking myself for to this day. I had a probably 8-foot by 6-foot section of my wall that was all Jakks Classic Superstars.
Right.
And the prices just kept going up, and I finally ended up just selling most of them on eBay, and I made a shit ton of money off of those things, but at the same time, now I don't have them, and I kind of wish I did. I kept a few. Like I said, I've got some signed ones. I've got a signed Roddy Piper, that Kevin Nash I've got signed. I've got a few that I kept. I've got a Dude Love. But, man, just thinking about how nice that collection looked pinned up on the wall, because they were all, I mean, that packaging was gorgeous. That gold foil on the top, just the shape of it. And they kept the design throughout the line. So the packaging didn't change style or shape or look. So if you collected from the first figure to the last figure, they all go together. So as a big display on the wall, they look fantastic. But, I mean, it really was just an amazing line. And Chris, as you mentioned earlier, they did the LJN reissues, or not reissues, but the LJN style figures that just looked awesome. Just really an impressive line. My personal favorite releases from Jakks, though, and I still have every single one of them that I bought, are the Maximum Sweat figures.
Do you fill them up with water every now and then?
I absolutely do. And the funny thing about them, and you obviously, Rich and Chris, you guys know this, but for the listeners, the Jakks Pacific Maximum Sweat figures are these big, super deformed versions of the Attitude Era wrestlers: Road Dogg, Stone Cold, Kane, Undertaker, Billy Gunn, Mankind. I could go on. I've got a couple dozen of them. But the original concept for these, I can't remember the name, but they were going to bleed. And they were going to include a little capsule of red liquid. And these figures have in their backs, they have a little plug that you open up, and you can put liquid in them, and they sort of ooze this liquid out of their foreheads, and the idea was that they would bleed. But Jakks Pacific probably wisely realized that bleeding action figures maybe wouldn't go over so well with Mom and Dad, so they changed the line to Maximum Sweat. So instead, you just put water in the figures, and they sweat, and it works. It's fine. It's a fun gimmick. It's great. But I really just love the crazy look of these figures with their. They look like, if you're familiar with the Sam Keith comic, The Max. These figures look like wrestler versions of the Max with these giant feet, giant hands, really weird, like little heads, super deformed, giant bodies. I love this line because it's such a bizarre concept, and what it's rooted in is just so absolutely gruesome and so Attitude Era. Do you guys remember these figures in this gimmick, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I never got into it, but I did hear the rumor that they were supposed to bleed, and they chose not to. So that's a fun little behind-the-scenes thing.
Chris, do you have any more insight into those guys?
I mean, they were the perfect figures to have if you wanted to reenact an interrogation scene and have them be a suspect who's getting a little hot under the collar.
Well, and what's so funny about it is they have that really cool, exaggerated artistic look. So they're almost these, like, you know, in this day and age, people are familiar with collectible vinyl toys that have exaggerated features or really weird looks to them. And these are those, but they also have this wacky action figure where you put a liquid in them and it oozes out in various places. And I love that line, and it's just one example of the many wild things that Jakks experimented with over their time with the WWF license. Before we move on, is there any more Jakks Pacific stuff that you guys remember that you want to bring up?
I mean, the Ruthless Aggression line kind of went hand in hand with the classic Superstars, so it was almost this universal molding and tooling the body type to where the modern roster went along with all the, you know, previous talents and all the classic guys that we were seeing. And that's why to this day, you know, that was the inspiration for the revival of FTC's wrestling figures, is because as much as Mattel's doing some pretty nice work, you know, like we said earlier, they're just not going to match up with the roster that Jakks had, both with the modern talent at the time going through the 2000s and all the guys they had in the classic line. And sure, there's going to be guys that are missed in both lines. You're not going to have a completely perfect roster, but you had John Cena and Randy Orton, and when Jeff Hardy returned, and, you know, Hornswoggle and Colin Delaney and CM Punk, and basically just guys from every era represented. And then you had your Hogans and Dude Loves and Ken Shamrocks and D'Lo Browns and everybody done through the classic line. It's just, you know, if you're playing with them, you can make all these dream matches. If you're collecting them, they look great standing up next to each other. They look great on a wall. It's just such a good job that they did. And, you know, they had their offbeat releases early on and their weird exclusives, or, you know, their wackiness like Maximum Sweat. But I think overall, Jakks was definitely more hit than miss.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that Ruthless Aggression line is where I got fully invested into what Jakks Pacific was doing. I mean, I was buying I was buying people that I wasn't even necessarily into, because also at the time I was as deep into the wrestling video games as I've ever been, because we were getting SmackDown versus Raw, and all of these incredible wrestling games, and me and my friends were on a regular basis sort of fantasy booking via these video games, and I loved having figures of everybody that was current at the time. So even if I didn't necessarily love a wrestler, like I've never been a fan of Randy Orton, but I had a Randy Orton figure because we used him in the roster that we were doing our fantasy booking with. And at the time, back when I had a lot more free time in my life, I was doing custom figures, because one of the great things about the Ruthless Aggression is they had a sort of a set number of bucks that they used. So I made a custom CM Punk. I made a custom Samoa Joe. I had a custom, at the time TNA, we were watching TNA from 2002. We watched the third Wednesday night pay-per-view and then on from there with TNA. So I was making a custom Petey Williams and Bobby Roode and like all of these guys. I had to make little fabric shorts for my CM Punk figure. And you could get $1 for just about anybody from these Ruthless Aggression figures, and find a head that like kind of fit in. I can't remember who I used for CM Punk. I want to say it might have been like a Billy Kidman head or something like that. But I was deep into Ruthless Aggression. I had a full wall of those figures loose, like ready to go with the ring. And I remember the first time Jakks put out that real scale ring, the what was it, 20 or 22 inch ring, with the fabric.
Yeah, the WrestleMania ring.
Yeah, that's right. The first one they did was the classic one, the classic WrestleMania ring. They did that before they did the Raw ring, if I remember correctly. But it had the fabric turnbuckles with the little foam pads inside. It had the springy ropes. It had the apron. And even though at that point I'm, well into my 20s or whatever, everybody I knew, all my friends came over, and we were sitting there playing with that real scale ring for like a full night, drinking beer, throwing figures in that ring, and having matches. It was amazing. And that's like I said, Jakks really understood the sport and the fans, and were just delivering on every level at that time.
And I'm glad you brought up TNA too before we get off the Jakks path, because when Mattel took over for WWE, Jakks took over TNA.
But before we get to that, we have to talk about Toy Biz's run with WCW and then with TNA.
That's true.
Because Toy Biz was huge with Marvel Legends. That was the line. And they picked up the WCW license and released some really bizarrely scaled but well-articulated figures. You would have a Diamond Dallas Page that was 5.5 inches tall, and a Billy Kidman that was 6.2 inches tall.
And a Rey Mysterio that was like an inch tall, because it came with like a Kevin Nash.
Yes, Rey was a prop.
Yes.
Rey was a lawn dart to reenact Kevin Nash throwing Rey at the side of the WCW production trailer. But yeah, what a bizarre. Let's talk about that a little bit. Toy Biz's WCW line. I feel like they came at it very much from we make comic book toys, and now we're going to make comic book toys of wrestlers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like right as they lost that WCW license is when they were starting to hit the stride and understand what they were doing, because the initial releases from Toy Biz were just insane. That, like, there's a great Scott Hall, there's a great Kevin Nash, But then there's a Bret Hart that has entirely different articulation and aesthetics that doesn't even make sense.
Well, and they did the same thing that Jax did with like the Stomp series with the Ringmasters.
Yes.
Do you remember those?
Well,
so you had like
actual Hitman.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and Chris Jericho was a lion tamer.
Circus props.
Well, and then they had the ones that had the magnets in their fists.
I hated those.
Oh, they were
I
terrible.
hated those.
They were terrible. But that's the only way you could get
Yes.
that's the only way you could get Dean Malenko for a while. And at the time,
That's
Dean
true.
Malenko was one of my favorite guys.
But, you know, I mean, I say it was terrible, but for toys, they were probably really cool. Like, I mean, you could flip the people. Like, I don't know. I mean, there's something about it. Like,
when I was a kid, I would get annoyed when things didn't
gimmicks.
scale up right and when things had unnecessary gimmicks. But Toy Biz essentially threw everything they could at the wall.
that's true.
Because they did a line that each came with a piece of the ring. They did the ring that had, and I still have this ring in my storage room, as a matter of fact. It's a plastic ring. It has a fabric square in the middle, and when you slam a figure on that fabric square, it goes, oh! Mm-hmm. Or if you hold the figure down, it does like a 1, 2, 3, ding, ding, ding. That's the Nitro ring. It's the WCW Nitro ring. And it's like, if it was to scale, it would be like a 6 foot by 6 foot ring. But, yeah, WCW got that, or Toy Biz got that WCW license and released some really wild stuff, but some of it worked, some of it did not. And then, eventually, WCW just sort of died, and I guess that was the point where Toy Biz took the TNA license.
Toy Biz didn't take TNA until about a year into TNA's run, like 2003, 2004. So there was some gap there. But Toy Biz had some wacky WCW stuff, but they also had some pretty great WCW stuff. I mean, they made a Disco Inferno with a disco pointer finger hand, so he could actually do his entrance taunt. And I think their Bam Bam Bigelow was a great figure. They made a Dennis Rodman. I mean, you know, San Francisco Toymaker had done him earlier, but those figures were pretty much kind of a flop.
Oh, San Francisco Toymakers. Okay, so for WCW, they were the vibrating figures.
Yes.
But then later on, they got the ECW license, and those are actually pretty good figures.
I love them. I had every one of them, and I no longer do, and I hate it. I hate it. I love those figures so much, especially the later ones, you know, when you got Axel, Axel and Balls Mahoney and Taz was first series, but yeah, you got a lot of cool ones.
Well,
later on,
the only figure I've got from that ECW line is Shane Douglas, because he's one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I thought this is probably the only way I'm ever going to get a Shane Douglas figure. Although I think, did Toy Biz release a WCW Shane Douglas?
They did towards the end in the Unleashed series.
Was that the same one Vampiro was in?
Vampiro and Mike Awesome were in Unleashed, but they were also... So Mike Awesome and Vampiro were released in KB toy stores around the U.S. Shane, I never saw in the store. I know a lot of people found him overseas at first.
Okay.
They did him towards the end, and it was such a limited release that he didn't even realize it had come out. Because he brought that up when we signed him for Figures Toy Company, and we were talking about his figure at one point, and he said that last figure, the WCW one, he didn't even realize it ever got released because of the timing of when WCW went under and seeing that figure come out.
Oh, wow, that's wild. And actually, I had a similar experience with when the one time that I very briefly met Bruce Campbell. I brought the 18-inch scale Ash figure that McFarlane Toys produced for him to sign, and he goes, "Wow, I haven't even seen this yet."
Oh, wow.
That's funny.
So
can we take a minute and talk about the Perry Saturn that came in a dress, like a leather dress from Toy Biz?
Oh, I had it.
Yes, it was a great. I love the gimmick first off, but second off, I love the figure as well. And those figures came with like crazy accessories, like huge dumpsters and like just crazy things.
The Rick Steiner that came with like a gargoyle gremlin thing.
Well, that was part of the Ringmasters
thing. But he had the leather jacket too. Like they had appropriate stuff for the figure. Because they did the first DDP they did was one of those stupid magnetic figures, but then later on they did a pretty good DDP with the jeans on and the shirt, and like it's almost like Toy Biz sort of course corrected as the line went on. Like they realized people kind of just wanted articulation and good figures, and the paint apps are crazy on those things by modern standards.
I wanted a Mortis and Glacier figure so bad, and I still do, because they would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see those. Those would be awesome. So, Toy Biz had a really weird but fun run with WCW. We had about a year gap, and they moved on to TNA, and I'm just going to point out that I bought every single one because, like I said, we were way into TNA when it started. I bought all of Toy Biz's TNA releases, and I actually have a 2-pack of Christopher Daniels and Homicide signed by Christopher Daniels and Homicide.
Nice.
One of my, we got because they had the first Bound for Glory pay-per-view was here in Atlanta, and they had a massive like fan event prior to the pay-per-view. Or the day before the pay-per-view, and I brought that set to get signed by those guys, and met basically everybody that was on the TNA roster at the time at that event. And it was I talked to Samoa Joe for a good half hour about wrestling video games, and it's crazy to me now that because at the time I just thought he was a badass wrestler, but now he's Samoa Joe, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, cause he came to TNA and I didn't know who he was. I just thought he was a badass. He was cool. But so they got the TNA license, and the scaling was still really bad for some of those because there's an AJ Styles figure that would be like 8 feet tall in real life. But they look great. They had crazy paint apps. They had lots of articulation. They were really strong, like, visually very good figures, but when you compare them to each other, maybe didn't work so well. And then after that TNA line, that was kind of the end of Toy Biz. And then we move on to Jakks Pacific getting the TNA line, which you guys are probably going to be able to talk about a whole lot better than I can.
Well, the TNA, when Jakks took over, the main focus at this point was they were Deluxe Impact. So WWE had made those Deluxe Classics and Deluxe Aggression, which were mainly Toys R Us exclusive figures. They weren't really widespread.
Right.
So now you had TNA figures that didn't coincide with as many of the WWE stars. And it was funny because as the license went on, not too long into it, but they started kind of going backwards in the sense where they started doing Ruthless Impact, which was almost the TNA exclusive set, but it was the set that would match up perfectly to all those former WWE releases. So while everything did kind of fit in with the previous molds, it was just kind of a weird way that they went about it, because you kind of started with doing a set, trying to, I guess, maybe make a more modern style, thinking that the Deluxe Classic was going to be the way to go because that was the way they were making the UFC figures at the time. But if you're a collector who backtracks, like we mentioned before, it's not really falling in line with many in your collection. And then they did sprinkle in some of the Ruthless style Impact figures, and they got a lot of names out there, a lot of figures that eventually started going for big money when the license ended and everything. I mean, you got the Motor City Machine Guns,
right?
You got Your Money, Team 3D, you got Abyss, a lot of guys that had been made in Toy Biz as well. But now people are thinking, hey, we're piggybacking off of the popularity of Jakks, so this is even better than some of those, mid-2000s Toy Biz figures. And, they could have done some really awesome things, I think, if they had continued with the license. But I feel like it was a combination of TNA faltering with all their, flaws and mistakes and mishaps on a business level, and Jakks not really doing much for production and distribution, because by the time the license was ending, they were only releasing like 2 or 3 figures at a time. I think the last wave or the next to last wave was Mr. Kennedy or Mr. Anderson at that point, and an Angelina Love. I think that was an actual series. Was just those 2.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
And
they did very few and far between.
That's a really good point, because the Motor City Machine Guns are one of my favorite tag teams of all time. But if I want figures of them, that's the only way to get them.
Well, you could always get the Toy Biz versions. They were just sold separately.
Did they do Alex
They did
Shelley, though? I know they did Sabin.
They did one later on.
They did a Chris Sabin by himself early on. Then they did him in a 2-pack with Kevin Nash. And then Alex Shelley was in Series 6. So at this point, they were like yellow cards. Mm-hmm. And it was when they did like Alex Shelley, Petey Williams. They did Eric Young in his babyface gimmick with the Don't Fire Eric t-shirt, and then in the Team Canada tights. So there were like some running changes and variants done. They did 2 Bobby Roodes. They did the Bobby Roode with the plastic robe, the black robe that Terry Taylor had given him, and also in his Team Canada gear. They did one of the Naturals. They were getting pretty deep towards the end.
See, I know I had the Sabin, but I didn't remember ever seeing an Alex Shelley.
Yeah, he came with a tripod because he was doing the paparazzi gimmick.
Oh my gosh, you're right. That's right.
And the Jay Lethal out of that series is spectacular.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I remember the Jay Lethal. Wow. Yeah, that line was more extensive than I remembered.
Jakks released a Devon, but never a Bubba Ray.
I know, and that Devon is great.
And I remember the inventory listing towards the end when I was ordering for FTC. And I think the set that never got made, they were going to do a Build-A-Figure, and the Build-A-Figure was going to be Tracy Brooks, and Hernandez was in the set, and a couple other people. I'll have to backtrack. There's probably information online, and I'm pretty sure our friends over at Fully Posable talked about it. But yeah, they had more stuff planned that just never came to fruition.
And see, I remember the Tracy Brooks Build-A-Figure now that you mention it, because I think Toy Fair covered it. And I'm trying to remember, was there a Hernandez figure? I feel like there was.
Yep, there was.
Okay.
Yeah, there was for X, but not for Toy Biz.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but there was a Homicide for Toy Biz.
Yeah, well, that's because Homicide was one of the initial releases, because I think they did a single carded Homicide, and they did the 2-pack that I've got with Homicide and Christopher Daniels.
No, that's the only one.
Oh, is that the only one they did? Okay.
Yeah, in the beginning waves, they did a Conan with Road Dogg. I'm trying to think. Yeah, because the first couple of 2-packs, it was like Jarrett and AJ Styles, then Sabu and Raven, and then Conan and Road Dogg, or Conan and Truth. Because the first waves were a lot of they did Jarrett and Raven, and they did Sabu, but then you got Abyss, AJ Styles, Monty Brown, Chris Sabin.
Monty Brown, oh my gosh.
The alpha male.
Yes.
Also known as Marcus Corvon.
Yeah.
Done by Jack, the ECW line.
Oh my gosh, that's wild. Okay, so.
It's funny, when Little Zach first started getting into the wrestling figures, and he was looking for new guys to play with, I have sadly sold off more than a couple of my figures because of a failed almost marriage about 10 years ago with an evil ex who took me for a ride financially. But that's whole other story for the podcast. So
I've been
there. Quickest way to recoup was to sell off a lot of the stuff that I got gifted to me through my job at FTC. But there were some random things still lingering at my parents' house and whatnot. And I was down in the basement one day, and I had a Monty Brown Minton card. And, there's not a lot of value in some figures, and Zach wanted a new guy to play with. And he has a Monty Brown and knows who Monty Brown is because Monty Brown was one of his first wrestling figures.
That's funny.
And the funniest thing about it, and this actually happened earlier tonight before we started recording, but he was doing D'Lo Brown's taunt, doing the "you're looking at the real deal now,"
Yes.
and bobbing his head. But he kept calling himself Monty Brown because he was trying to spear me down. So he was trying to do the pounce, and he cross references D'Lo Brown and Monty Brown, and it's just like one of the funniest things to see him do.
Oh man, and I'll tell you, I need a good D'Lo Brown figure. My gosh, I love D'Lo. Yeah, it's funny because my son, not super into wrestling, but he has a ton of my old wrestling figures that he uses as goons for like Batman and whatever. And one of his favorites is the Jakks Deluxe Bobby Lashley figure. Because he's just a huge, muscular, scary-looking dude. So he's always like the main goon for like the bad guys. Is that Bobby Lashley? So that brings us up to we've talked about Jakks TNA figures, and I guess right around the same time, Mattel launched their WWE figures. I can't remember what year it was, but I know it was January 1st was the first day they were on shelves. And they started with, they had a regular line and a Legends or Classics line, right?
The Legends line didn't start right away. They did the main line, and it was like a WrestleMania Heritage Series because Steve Austin was in that series. I'm trying to think of everyone who was in that series. But I remember going out, and I remember some of them had gotten put out locally on New Year's Eve. And I want to say like the first 5 or 6 waves of Mattel also had the Chase variants that had the belts included. And so people were kind of going nuts looking to see like who was coming with the belts. Because I remember I found the Steve Austin with the belt in the WrestleMania Heritage set, and somebody on a forum actually paid me $35 for it.
Nice.
Because, the heat coming off of the release of everything, and it was, the thrill of the hunt.
Yeah. Well, it was exciting. Anytime there's some kind of new launch like that, it's exciting. Like, I love new toy line launches. It's a cool thing.
Absolutely.
So let's, we all know that Mattel has, in mainstream markets, Mattel is it right now. And they're doing perfectly good, cool stuff. And I've actually been impressed with some of the sets they've done, like the recent Kurt Angle milk truck set that they did.
Milkamania.
Yeah, with Stephanie McMahon, that looks incredibly inappropriate out of context.
Yes, it does.
But, as you've mentioned a couple of times now, Figures Toy Company is, to me, carrying on the legacy of what Jakks was doing in creating really notable, impressive, fan-oriented stuff, and truly high-quality figures. I still say that Delirious is one of the best wrestling figures that's ever been released. What has been, Chris, what's been your process as far as figuring out what you guys are going to release and who you're going to deal with, and because I feel like there's always some exciting new announcement coming from you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate to be given carte blanche over the wrestling stuff some years back. I mean, even back when we were just kind of handling the WWE stuff, I mentioned earlier, I got to do a lot of exclusives. I got to handle the inventory. Jakks was really cool about breaking up assortments and sending us, solid cases or straight cases as they're known. So let's say it was going to be the first Jeff Hardy when he came back in 2006, but we're sitting on 5 different John Cenas. I could tell Jakks, hey, send me 500 of the Jeff Hardy, but we only need about 150 John Cenas, and they would do it. They would not ship a case assortment. They would send a case breakdown the way that we needed it. So that was kind of my first foray into the action figure world, and how that's parlayed into FTC's exclusive lines, or the ones that I'm doing personally. My boss entrusted me with getting the Ring of Honor license up and running a couple of years ago, and we've been very successful with that. We actually just renewed it, so the figures that were kind of in limbo for a little while were able to get released. We just released the Row to go along with the Hanson that we had released earlier last year. So we've beaten Mattel to the punch on doing the War Raiders, because they were War Machine in ROH before they went to NXT, and we beat them to the punch on Roderick Strong. We also got Dalton Castle and Matt Taven out. So with Ring of Honor, it was always taking a look at the main guys on the roster, which is something I'll be doing in the future. I can tell you guys right now that all, and when I say all, I mean 99.9% of the current Ring of Honor roster that is all under exclusive or full-time ROH contracts have already had pictures taken for the process to begin. I have seen 4 sculpts so far, but our team is hard at work. There's going to be 25 to 30 new Ring of Honor figures over the next 2 years.
Oh my gosh.
So
wow.
Just with the Ring of Honor line alone. Now, that's not to throw to the side the Legends of Professional Wrestling or the Rising Stars of Wrestling that we're doing.
Right.
The Legends being a continuation of that older set that we had done that predated the Jakks Classic Superstars, which, as an aside that I've mentioned before, we actually voluntarily gave up our original Legends line, which featured the Abdullah the Butcher, the King Kong Bundy. I had done Ricky Steamboat and Eddie Gilbert and so many guys back in the late 90s and early 2000s, but because we were working with WWE and had their license for the belt, when Jakks came to us and mentioned they had plans for the Classic line, we didn't want to be a competitor to someone that we were working with, and we voluntarily ended the line at that time. So it was really cool to be able to get that back up and running a couple of years back and do it piggybacking on that Jakks style to fit in with Classic Superstars and to fit in with Ruthless Aggression. So we were able to do a Shane Douglas when he hadn't been made since the dying days of WCW. We were able to parlay our KISS license into doing a KISS Demon figure, because if there are 2 fan bases that are willing to go hard on collecting, it is KISS fans and wrestling fans. So it's the perfect combination. And with the Rising Stars of Wrestling, I can...
wait. Before we move on to Rising Stars,
sure.
I have to give props for that Jim Cornette figure.
Yes, that is... I wish we were able to do the racket. The tooling on certain pieces just isn't cost-effective for an independent company, and some people might think it doesn't make sense, and I can certainly get that. But I think that's a great figure, and to a lot of collectors, that was a bit of a holy grail, because they had actually done a prototype of him for the TNA Legends line that never came out.
Yeah. I mean,
there are a lot of people that are looking forward to that.
It's freaking Jim Cornette. I mean, regardless of how you feel about him, it's Jim Cornette. Mm-hmm. You have to have him.
And I wonder if those same people are going to feel the same way with the Vince Russo that's coming out in the future.
Oh, get out of here. Really?
The next Legends line is going to feature Francine of ECW fame. I was able to befriend the brother of Chris Candido, Johnny Candido, who signed off on the estate of his brother for the first Chris Candido figure since the ECW line.
Wow.
Vince Russo will be made. Vince Russo has been sculpted, but we haven't revealed it yet. We have shown Candido and Francine.
Does Russo come with a restraining order?
I actually made a joke before we decided to do him for a figure when someone on Twitter suggested that we do him, and Cornette actually retweeted this, and I said, we'd like to, but we couldn't keep it in the same warehouse as our Cornette figure.
That's awesome.
Because that was right around the time all that stuff was breaking out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love the fact that Cornette was selling signed restraining orders.
If there is money to be made, wrestlers will find a way.
Absolutely.
It's one of the best things that they're able to market themselves that way.
Absolutely.
And there will be a 4th name from the wrestling boom of the mid to late 90s. It's an international star. We have not revealed him yet. He will be revealed soon. Someone who has not ever been made, and someone who has been a real pleasure to deal with. That secret will probably be getting let out in the next couple of weeks because it's been a while since we've really revealed anything. And then the Rising Stars of Wrestling, which is the line that focuses on the indie talent, or can't even really say indie. I guess maybe free agent is the best way to put it because people are, cutting so many deals and there's so much going on in wrestling these days. But, it started with doing about a dozen names and, we tackled the guys that were going viral and getting those names out there. So we did the Young Bucks and we did Gallows in both the standard and the face paint version. We did the New Japan version of AJ Styles. We did Kenny Omega. Some of those figures have since sold out. Some of them are still in stock, but it's a line that has continued all the way up until the current day. We've got about a dozen more in production right now. We're doing Joey Janela. We're doing Shane Strickland. We're doing Flip Gordon. We're doing David Finlay, the son of Finlay. We're doing
awesome.
A lot of New Japan talent, a lot of guys that have become popular through ROH or that have made deals with AEW or you've seen them on PWG. It's really just me trying to keep my pulse on the industry. I'm an avid fan. I'm an avid collector. I'm trying to tie both of those loves in and generating that towards the collector audience and figure audience. And it's just great to see the groundswell that the lines have had. Because, you'll have your detractors, any toy line, we're all toy collectors here, so you're never going to have a perfect toy line. There's always going to be some type of flaw or figure that, you're going to not see perfection in or want to complain about. And I do feel there is a bit of a mob mentality out there because a lot of the forums and podcasts do steer a lot towards Mattel, and I feel like if you didn't grow up on Jakks like we did, or if you only know Mattel because you're of a certain age or only hear certain people talk about it, maybe you're not going to like our figures. But I think our design team does some killer work. I totally agree with you on Delirious. I think that Kiss Demon figure came out fantastic. I think Juventud Guerrera was great. I think the likeness on some of the figures like Rocky Romero and Jeff Cobb and Chris Hero look amazing. And let's face it, who knows if or when any of these guys would ever get a figure at all, or if any of these younger guys are ever going to get another figure, because Chris Hero's been back with WWE for a couple of years now, and they haven't even touched him yet.
Right.
So, it all depends on what Mattel is feeling, what any other toy company is feeling, and as long as we can ride the wave of wrestling's popularity, I want to do all these names that have that social media fan base or have that groundswell of support, who are appearing on various shows and getting their name out there, because the more visible they are, the more visible their figure is, and that's only a good thing for FTC's name.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys are, if you're a wrestling fan, unless you're just purely a mainstream WWE guy, if you're a wrestling fan, you've kind of got your fingers in a lot of different pies, a lot of different areas, and Mattel simply isn't serving every interest that you have, and you guys are coming in what to me is the seminal wrestling figure style. That ruthless aggression style that Jakks invented is, in my head, when I picture a wrestling figure, that's what it looks like. And, other lines have other things to offer, and I love cartoony stuff, I love articulated stuff, I love whatever. But that, to me, in the same way that a 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joe figure is my idea of that scale, that ruthless aggression style is my idea of a wrestling figure. And you guys are hitting so many different things with what you're doing on that. Before we wrap this thing up, I want to ask you, and this is a tough question, but do you guys have a single favorite figure and a single favorite line from all of wrestling toys? Let's start with you, Rich. Like, do you have
you start with me?
Well, do you have like a prized possession, like a man, this is the figure I'm really just so proud that I have?
I mean, he's one of my favorite wrestlers. We've mentioned him in this podcast, I think. And he's the first Mattel figure I ever bought. I can't remember the series, but the Big Van Vader that came out of Mattel but it had the Mastodon helmet.
Yes.
And the Vader mask. I just think it's a gorgeous figure. I mean, it's a pretty hard figure to find, and I remember I found it at Walmart. I was walking into Walmart, and they apparently got too many cases or what. I wasn't even really looking at wrestling figures at the time, and so at the very front of the store, they just had all these wrestling figures, and they had a bunch of the Van Hammers. Or boy, that's a different figure. The Van Vader, Van Vaders. So I bought one, not even really collecting anything, but it was just so cool. It's just such a great figure that I really am glad I own that figure. As far as a line, I mean, it's really tough, but I mean, that Jax line, like, you remember, like, they would come out with, like, special editions and, like, different pay-per-view names, and they would just rehash figures, really, and just put them in different packagings, and you could find them at KB. Yeah, you can find them at KB for, like, 3 for 10 if you waited long enough.
Sure.
And I would buy all of those and just put them all over my walls. I just loved them. And I mean, I don't have them, so it's not a very specific line, but it was basically any wrestling figure you could find at KB. Because they did, I feel like they had the exclusives or stuff that only they had, because you couldn't really find it everywhere. So, I don't know, that Jax line is just so... It's really the first action figure since He-Man that I really focused on buying for myself, so it'll always hold a special place.
I think my favorite line is probably Hasbro's WWF line. They're so collectible, they're so accessible, and I've got a ton of them, but I don't have nearly all of them, and there's something that I can kind of constantly pursue, but just enjoy. Like, they're not hard to get, but I'm always on the lookout for them. My favorite single figure, I'm actually holding it in my hand right now. It's from Jakks Pacific. It's not the William Regal that I mentioned before. It's a William Regal that was some kind of mail-in or special release. He comes in a small box as opposed to a blister card, and it's a WWE Limited. It's in a British flag, a Union Jack box, a window box, and he has the Born Naughty T-shirt on, but it's like a fabric shirt that comes off of the figure, and he's got a black eye. And
were those the Toy Fair exclusive figures?
Kind of that bare knuckle gimmick.
I'm not sure. I bought it off of eBay a few years ago because, as I mentioned, William Regal, my favorite wrestler of all time. And I have the Born Naughty T-shirt, which is one of the few pieces of merchandise William Regal has ever had. And this is wearing that same T-shirt and is just such a unique, interesting figure. And underneath, I haven't ever opened it up, but underneath you can tell he's actually wearing the singlet as opposed to the trunks, the red trunks that he typically wears. Mm-hmm. And it's just, I love it. It's in this pristine box. I got it off of eBay, I don't know how many years ago, but it's a limited edition, one of 3,000, and I love it. I love the fact that I own this figure that's wearing a T-shirt that I own. What about you, Chris? Favorite line, favorite single wrestling toy item?
The favorite would have to be the one that I mentioned earlier, that Hollywood Blondes 2-pack. Yeah, I was blown out when they revealed that was coming out, and knowing that it was going to be a Toys R Us exclusive, it was kind of a thrill of the hunt of getting that one. I still have it mint on card, never cracked it open.
And I remember those coming out because they did a whole series. They would release like 3 2-packs at a time for a while, because I think they did, the Killer Bees maybe?
They did Killer Bees. They did a horrendous Rock and Roll Express.
Oh, yeah, gosh. Ooh, yeah, I remember that.
But they did a great Midnight Express.
Which is funny because they didn't have a cornet to go with it.
Yep. Then they had some peg warmers. They had Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson. Yeah, that was the Toys R Us exclusive for a while.
Yeah.
They did Abe Knuckleball Schwartz and Bobby Heenan.
I don't remember that, but that's awesome.
So when you want to talk
remember
about the plethora of releases through Jakks, I mean,
that's great.
Abe, I don't see Abe Schwartz coming out from Mattel anytime soon.
No, you're all right.
As much as I can speak highly of Jakks, and, I'll be completely honest, I'm not a Mattel hater at all. In fact, not only do I still collect some things for myself, but I'm kind of living vicariously through little Zach because he's such a wrestling fan, and he adores not only the main roster now, but he will watch the network, and he's into the old characters. I mean, my son is not even 4, and he has matches with the Berserker figure, so how great is that?
That's awesome.
Not to take away from any of the modern lines, but I just, I don't know if you want to call it the nostalgia, the fond memories. Like I said, I could remember getting Series 1 in the particular order that my grandmother bought them in. Nothing beats Hasbro for me. Hasbro, I think, was just such a great line, just fun to collect, great-looking characters. It's full of nostalgia. It's full of fun memories. And it's something that, has driven me to collect. Like, I buy that Mattel Retro line. I actually normally will buy 2 of each so that I can crack one open and leave one on the card. And it's not because I see any tremendous value in a lot of them, even though some of them do have some value. It's just that eventually I want to, again, have that display going and show them off because I just love that style of figure. I think they're really fun to look at. I always thought they were fun to play with. And I just think that they are, to this day, probably my favorite line that I've ever collected.
Well, and those cards are such a nostalgia blast because Mattel is pretty much recreating them exactly. So just looking at them is just delightful to remember that. And I'll say this, I got the ring, and if they don't make some title belts soon, I'm going to lose my mind. Because
there's a rumor going around that the ring is being discontinued.
Really?
There is a rumor going around, so a lot of people have been gobbling them up. I know it's been as low as like 16 on Amazon, but I saw people that still have Kmart's in their area have found them for as low as 12.
Well, the ring has the 2... it's basically a reproduction of the original Hasbro ring, and it has the 2 spots to put the title belts on, but we have no title belts yet. And it's driving me nuts.
Yeah, because at least the Hasbro ring came with the Winged Eagle title, the world title.
Right, exactly. All right, well, I think we have done a pretty good job of covering at least our personal memories of wrestling toys. I don't think there are too many nooks and crannies that we overlooked. Before we go, I got to find out, where are you guys online and what are you up to? Let's start with Chris. Where can we find you online? What are you doing?
All right. Well, a lot of times you can actually find me with Richard on the Nerdy Laser podcast. We had a bit of downtime during the holidays, but we're coming back strong in the coming weeks. I know we've got a podcast coming up next week, which has a topic near and dear to our hearts. Of course, it has to do with 90s nostalgia. But as far as finding me personally, you can always check out figurestoycompany.com and wrestlingsuperstore.com. Aside from the wrestling figures that we've mentioned that I make, we are responsible for the quote-unquote Mego revival, the retro figure revival of 8-inch action figures for DC Comics, Hanna-Barbera, Kiss, the Monkees, the Three Stooges, and a whole lot more. Some great stuff just came into stock. We've got a new Nightwing out, a Man-Bat figure. We've got a new line of U.S. presidents, Scooby-Doo, which I know Richard is a big fan of. Just some great stuff that you can see at figurestoycompany.com. You can find those wrestling figures on that site and over at wrestlingsuperstore.com, along with some other wrestling merchandise like T-shirts and action figure gear. If you want to follow us on social media, it's at Figures Toy Co. on Twitter, at WRES_Superstore on Twitter. You can look up the company name on Facebook and Instagram. And if you would like to follow me, you can check me out on Twitter at Zach Malibu and over at bulletproofaction.com. The name of my column is No Surrender Cinema, where I review various movies, typically in the action variety. Latest review just went up last week to celebrate Black History Month. It was a review of Canon Films' epic movie, Rappin'. So be sure to check all that stuff out, and that's how you can find me online.
Awesome. Rich, what are you up to? Where can we find you?
Well, I am part of 3 podcasts, like Chris said, the Nerdy Laser podcast. It releases every week, as does the PWR Spot Show, which is a wrestling podcast. And we have the Assignment Horror podcast, and we have an episode that we did with Chuck Dixon, the co-creator of Bane. So that was pretty awesome. We talked about Lair of the White Worm. Best way to find any of those things are on iTunes, Podbean, or SoundCloud. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Nerdy Laser, and I have all the links to those things there, and I share other things, and yeah, that's about it for me.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming on, talking about wrestling toys on the road to WrestleMania, and we will talk to both of you again sooner than later. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
I want to remind everyone that you can find me on episode 32 of the Nerdy Laser podcast, talking to Rich. If you Google Nerdy Laser podcast, you will find it. We actually recorded, because my scheduling is so tricky right now, I recorded with Rich episode 32 of the Nerdy Laser podcast right before we recorded this episode 258 of the Needless Things podcast, because it was sort of a night of, okay, let's get this all done, because I wanted to talk to Rich, and I appreciate the fact that he was interested in talking to me about my career and what I do, and it was a really great interview. You should definitely go listen to it, and I'm glad you listened to this episode of the Needless Things podcast, because talking about wrestling toys with those two guys who in my circle of people I consider the experts of wrestling toys was a whole lot of fun. And I look forward to talking to them again soon. Let's see here. Go and join the Needless Things podcast Facebook group, which you can find by going to Facebook and looking for Needless Things podcast. Like Needless Things on Facebook. Follow Needless Things podcast on Instagram. Follow Phantom Troublemaker on Instagram. And go to needlessthingspodcast.com every day during the week. We don't post every single day, but we're close. Every single Friday, there's a new episode of the Needless Things podcast. We usually have posts Monday. Every single Tuesday, I do a home video post. And, we love you guys.
Thank you for listening to the Needless Things podcast. You're the best. You can find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, Downcast, or in the ears of a Trader Vic's employee. Love you. Mean it. Uh-huh.